There is a question that historians refuse to ask out loud. Not because they haven't thought of it, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the moment you ask it directly, the moment you say it plainly in a room full of academics, something shifts, the air changes, eyes move away from yours. The conversation pivots to something safer, something less uncomfortable, something that doesn't require confronting what should be the most obvious anomaly in the entire study of human history. The question is this: why don't we have the books? Not just some books, not just the fragile ones, the unlucky ones, the ones stored in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'm talking about the systematic, almost total absence of primary source material from before 1800, the original documents, the uncopied manuscripts, the first-generation texts that should, by any reasonable expectation, exist in abundance given how many centuries of literate civilization supposedly produced them. They're not there. And I don't mean they're hard to find. I don't mean they're locked in restricted archives or buried under decades of bureaucratic red tape. I mean when you look for them, when you actually request originals, when you press past the facsimiles and the digitized reproductions, and the scholarly editions published 2 centuries after the fact, what you find is absence. Systematic, total, inexplicable absence. I need you to sit with that for a moment before we go any further. Because everything I'm about to show you depends on understanding just how strange that absence is, how impossible it should be, how loudly it should be screaming at every historian, every archivist, every institution that claims to be the steward of human knowledge, and how deafening the silence is in response. Let's start with what we are told. We are told that human civilization has been producing written records for approximately 5,000 years, that libraries, in various forms, have existed for most of that literate history, that monks copied manuscripts through the medieval period with obsessive care, that Islamic scholars preserved Greek texts through centuries when Europe supposedly forgot them, that Renaissance humanists rediscovered and circulated ancient wisdom, that universities accumulated knowledge across generations, that printing presses multiplied texts by the thousands after Gutenberg. We are told, in other words, that knowledge was being preserved, actively, deliberately, consistently preserved by people who understood its value and devoted their lives to its protection. So where is it? Where are the originals that all those copies were copied from? Where are the manuscripts that predated the monks who copied them? Where are the working libraries of the universities that supposedly functioned continuously from the 12th century onward? Where are the accumulated texts of civilizations that we are told were sophisticated enough to build cathedrals, calculate astronomical events, conduct long-distance trade across entire continents, and maintain complex legal and administrative systems? The answer we're given is fire. Always fire. Fire and flood, and the general entropy of fragile materials across turbulent centuries. We're told to accept that the losses were natural, inevitable, the unavoidable cost of preserving organic materials through wars and disasters, and the simple passage of time. And individually, as I said, each explanation sounds plausible. Of course fires happen, of course manuscripts decay, of course wars destroy things. But here is where the official story breaks down completely, and I want you to follow this carefully, because the break is in the pattern, not in any single event. When you map the losses, when you stop treating each fire as an isolated tragedy, and start looking at them as a collective phenomenon, something comes into focus that changes everything. The destruction wasn't spread evenly across history. It clustered. Between roughly 1650 and 1850, a window of approximately 200 years, libraries across the known world burned with a frequency and thoroughness that has no parallel in any other period. Continent after continent, decade after decade, repository after repository, the most significant collections of pre-modern knowledge, the archives that should have anchored our understanding of everything that came before, reduced to ash within the same narrow historical window. Let me give you the timeline, because I need you to see this laid out, not as a list of tragic accidents, but as a sequence. The Great Fire of London. Beyond the obvious human cost, St. Paul's Cathedral and its adjacent booksellers' district burns. An estimated 100,000 books destroyed. Many were irreplaceable manuscripts held by London's largest booksellers, documents that had survived the Reformation, the Civil War, generations of political upheaval, only to burn in a single night. The Escorial Fire in Spain. The Royal Library of El Escorial, one of the most significant repositories in the world, containing manuscripts from the Islamic Golden Age, Visigothic texts and documents from the Spanish conquest of the Americas, severely damaged, thousands of volumes lost. The Stockholm Palace Fire. The Royal Library of Sweden, including the entire collection of medieval Nordic manuscripts held in the Three Crowns Castle, destroyed. texts documenting Scandinavian history that existed nowhere else, gone. The Copenhagen University Library fire. Thousands of medieval manuscripts, unique Norse historical texts, documents that formed the foundational record of Danish and Norwegian history. Lost. Ashburnham House, London. The Cotton Library, one of England's most important collections of Anglo-Saxon manuscripts, partially destroyed. Texts that had survived since before the Norman conquest, burned in a library fire in the middle of a city at peace. The Lisbon earthquake and its aftermath. The Royal Library, the Jesuit archives, the collections of numerous monasteries and private scholars, obliterated. Estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of documents relating to Portuguese global exploration, correspondence with civilizations across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, vanished. The Harvard College Library fire. America's oldest academic collection, much of it donated from England and representing decades of accumulated scholarship, destroyed. The Turin fire. The Royal Library of Savoy, containing significant collections of medieval Italian and French manuscripts, severely damaged. Revolutionary France. This one is different, and I want you to notice the difference. This wasn't an accident. This was policy. The revolutionaries systematically emptied, dispersed, and in many cases destroyed the libraries of the aristocracy and the church. Private collections accumulated over centuries, monastic archives representing generations of scholarly work, the private libraries of families whose wealth had allowed them to collect texts that public institutions couldn't access or afford, scattered, burned, lost. Moscow, Napoleon's retreat. The Kremlin archives, the libraries of Moscow's great houses, historical collections that documented Russian history back to the Kievan Rus period, gone in the fires that consumed the city. Washington, D.C., the Library of Congress, the newly formed repository of American governmental knowledge, burned by British troops. 3,000 volumes lost. Write those dates down, read them again slowly. 1666, 1671, 1697, 1728, 1731, 1755, 1764, 1788, 1794, 1812, 1814. That is 11 major library destructions in approximately 150 years. And I haven't mentioned the smaller fires, the monastery dissolutions across England and Germany, the gradual dispersal of Islamic library collections across the Ottoman period, the destruction of the great Aztec and Mayan codex collections by Spanish missionaries earlier in the 1500s, the burning of the Library of Nalanda in India, the fall of the libraries of Constantinople. But the clustering remains, and clustering is not what random disasters look like. Here is something else I need you to understand about that list. Look at what those fires specifically destroyed. Not just books in general, not just any accumulated texts. The fires targeted, with what I can only describe as uncanny precision, the repositories of pre-modern knowledge, the manuscripts that documented the medieval period, the texts that preserved Islamic scientific and philosophical traditions, the archives that recorded histories of peoples and civilizations before European global expansion. The documents that contained alternative accounts of events we now know only through the version that survived. The fires didn't burn accounting ledgers from the 1700s. They didn't consume the correspondence of minor bureaucrats or the administrative records of municipal governments. Those things, ironically, survived in abundance. We have extraordinary detail about the day-to-day functioning of early modern states, the receipts and inventories and court proceedings of the 17th and 18th centuries. What burned was older. What burned was deeper. What burned was precisely the material that would allow us to independently verify what we're told about the ancient and medieval worlds. And there's another element to this that gets almost no attention. The texts that survived. I want you to think carefully about the provenance of what we have. The manuscripts that formed the foundation of our understanding of classical antiquity, the documents that supposedly preserve the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome, the texts we use to reconstruct medieval European history, the chronicles we rely on to understand civilizations that no longer exist. Where did they come from? Who held them? Who authenticated them? When you trace the surviving manuscripts back through their documented histories, a pattern emerges that is deeply uncomfortable. An enormous proportion of what we consider authoritative primary sources for pre-modern history was discovered, authenticated, or published in the period between roughly 1700 and 1900, the very window during which everything else was burning. Think about what that means. The fires destroyed the repositories where original texts were held, and then in the aftermath of those fires, in the institutions that arose to replace what had been lost, carefully curated collections of authenticated manuscripts appeared. Collections whose provenance, whose chain of custody, whose documentation of origin traces back to the same narrow window, the same period, the same moment of institutional consolidation. Let's talk about authentication, because this is where the house of cards becomes visible if you're willing to look at it honestly. When historians say a manuscript is authentic, when they say a text dates to the medieval period or to classical antiquity, what are they actually claiming? What does that authentication rest on? Before carbon dating, which wasn't developed until the mid-20th century, authentication relied almost entirely on paleographic analysis. Comparing handwriting styles, letter forms, orthographic conventions against known exemplars to determine when and where a document was likely produced. This sounds rigorous, it sounds scientific, but here's the problem. Those known exemplars, the comparison documents that allow paleographers to say, this handwriting matches 12th century Carolingian script, or this letter form is consistent with 9th century insular practice, where did those exemplars come from? From other manuscripts. Manuscripts whose authenticity was established by comparing them to other manuscripts. Manuscripts that were collected, authenticated, and published predominantly during the same 1700 to 1900 window. Do you see the circularity? The dating system is self-referential. We authenticate ancient documents by comparing them to documents whose own authentication rests on comparison to still other documents, and the entire chain, if you follow it back far enough, terminates not in independent verification, but in a closed loop of mutual authentication, established during the same period when the original sources were burning. And when we do have carbon dating, which we now apply to older manuscripts, remember what it actually measures. It dates the parchment, the physical material on which the text was written, but parchment was expensive. Parchment was reused. There is an established scholarly practice called palimpsest, where scribes scraped or washed older texts off parchment to reuse the material for new writing. A carbon-dated manuscript that says, this parchment is from the 11th century, tells us exactly when the animal that produced the skin lived. It tells us nothing about when the text currently on that parchment was written. I'm not saying every medieval manuscript is a forgery. I want to be precise about what I am saying, because the implications of precision matter here. What I'm saying is this. The authentication standards we rely on for pre-modern documents were established primarily during the 18th and 19th centuries by institutions operating under state authority, authenticating collections that came predominantly from elite private sources, using methods that are circular in their dependency on comparison documents of similar uncertain origin. And the original materials that would allow us to independently verify these standards, the unmediated primary sources that should anchor the entire system, burned, systematically, during the same period when the authentication standards were being established. That is not a minor methodological footnote, that is a foundational problem. Now I want to talk about who survived. Because here's the thing about those fires, they weren't universal, they didn't touch everything. While monastery libraries burned and university collections vanished and public repositories across Europe succumbed to flames with remarkable consistency, a specific category of collection remained mysteriously, suspiciously, comprehensively intact. Private aristocratic libraries. The great houses of Europe, the families whose wealth and lineage stretch back into the medieval period, whose names appear in the genealogies of European royalty, whose estates were built in the same centuries as the monastery libraries that burned. Their collections survived. Not just survived, survived intact, survived complete, survived with their pre-1700 holdings, their medieval manuscripts, their texts from the early modern period, their documents from precisely the era that disappeared everywhere else, still on the shelves behind the locked doors of private estates that scholars and historians are not, to this day, permitted to freely access. Think about what that means structurally. The fires that destroyed public repositories left private aristocratic collections untouched. The revolutionary movements that explicitly targeted the libraries of the aristocracy as symbols of elitist knowledge hoarding somehow missed or exempted the deepest, oldest, most historically significant collections. The Napoleonic Wars that burned Moscow and consumed the institutional libraries of half of Europe left the private collections of certain families intact, moved to country estates, relocated to secondary properties, protected by the same networks of wealth and political connection that allowed those families to survive every other historical upheaval. And now, centuries later, when historians identify gaps in the historical record, when scholars acknowledge that certain questions about pre-modern history cannot be answered because the primary sources don't exist, those same families maintain private libraries containing materials from precisely the period in question. And they won't open them. Not to independent scholars, not to universities, not to the national archives of the countries in which those estates sit, not to the researchers who might, finally, be able to answer the questions that have shaped the historical profession for 200 years. Why? What is in those collections that cannot be seen? What knowledge sits behind the locked doors of estates in England, in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, protected by centuries of inherited privilege and the simple, unarguable fact of private property? What texts did these families consider important enough to protect across every upheaval of the last 500 years, while the rest of the world's documentary heritage burned? I want you to sit with the structure of this for a moment, because it matters. Public repositories burned, private elite collections survived. The public repositories have been replaced by state institutions, whose collections were assembled primarily from materials authenticated during the 18th and 19th centuries. The private collections that survived remain inaccessible, and the historical record we have is built almost entirely on what the state institutions hold. That is not a coincidence of circumstance, that is a structure of control. There's a specific category of loss that I keep returning to, because it points towards something larger than simple destruction. Certain types of knowledge disappear from the historical record with a consistency that goes beyond what random destruction would produce. Technical knowledge, specifically technical knowledge that implies capabilities we're told ancient and medieval civilizations didn't possess. Ancient astronomical texts that, based on references in surviving secondary sources, described observational methods, Rückwarung precision instruments we don't believe existed. Medieval engineering manuals describing construction techniques that our modern analysis of surviving buildings tells us must have existed, but whose actual documentation is gone. Alchemical and protochemical texts whose references in secondary literature suggest a practical, applied understanding of material properties that contradicts the narrative of pre-modern ignorance about natural science. Maps, this one is particularly striking. Several maps have survived from the early modern period that depict coastlines and geographical features with an accuracy that should be impossible, given what we know about the navigational and surveying tools available when they were supposedly made. The Peary Rise map of 1513 shows the coastline of Antarctica in forms that weren't confirmed by modern survey until the 20th century. The Orontius Phineus map of 1531 depicts Antarctica not as a featureless ice mass, but as a continent with mountain ranges and river systems that modern subglacial topography partially confirms. The Buech map of 1737 shows Antarctica divided into two land masses separated by a sea channel, a feature that modern sonar mapping has since identified under the ice. These maps exist, they're in archives, they're authenticated. And the standard explanation that they must be based on earlier sources, sources that no longer exist, sources that were lost before we could examine them, is extraordinary. Because that explanation requires the existence of an earlier, more sophisticated cartographic tradition, a tradition with access to global navigational capability centuries before we're told such capability existed, and the documentation of that tradition, the maps and texts and technical manuals that would tell us how it was done. Burned, lost, gone, and we're expected to note this anomaly in a footnote and move on. I want to make a specific argument now about what this pattern means, because I think most people who look at this evidence stop short of the full implication. The standard fringe explanation is deliberate suppression, a conspiracy of elites who burned the books to control knowledge, to rewrite history, to establish a false narrative of linear progress from ignorance to enlightenment that justified their own power and delegitimized alternative ways of understanding the world. I'm not going to tell you that explanation is wrong, because the evidence doesn't allow me to rule it out. But I want to offer something more precise than that, because I think precision matters if we actually want to understand what happened. The period between 1650 and 1850 was a period of radical institutional consolidation. The nation-state, as a political form, was solidifying across Europe. National identities were being constructed. Languages were being standardized. Legal and administrative systems were being unified under central authority. The scientific revolution was establishing new standards for what counted as legitimate knowledge. The Enlightenment was building a new framework for human understanding that explicitly rejected what it called superstition, mysticism, and the irrational. In this context, a vast amount of pre-existing knowledge was not just inconvenient, it was actively incompatible with the world being constructed. Not because the elites who controlled this process were uniquely evil, but because the project of modernity required a particular story about the past, a story of progress from primitive to advanced, a story of reason replacing superstition, a story of nation over region, of standardized language over dialect, of institutional science over traditional knowledge, of verified history over oral tradition and alternative chronicle. That story required a past that looked a certain way. And the pre-modern documentary record, the actual texts produced by actual people who understood the world differently, who recorded knowledge in frameworks that didn't fit the emerging narrative, whose histories complicated the national mythologies being constructed, who possessed technical and philosophical traditions that didn't fit the story of linear progress from Dark Ages to Enlightenment, that documentary record was, at minimum, deeply inconvenient. Whether the fires were deliberately set, or whether they represent the accumulated effect of institutional neglect, of decisions about what to protect and what to let burn, of choices about what to relocate before a war and what to leave behind, the result was the same. The incompatible past burned, the compatible past survived. And we were left with a history that tells exactly the story the emerging order needed it to tell. Let me tell you about something that almost never comes up in discussions of historical methodology, the question of what we mean when we say we know something about the past. We know Julius Caesar existed. We know approximately when he lived and roughly what he did and how he died. How do we know? Because texts describing him have survived. Texts that were preserved, copied, authenticated, and transmitted to us through institutional channels. But those surviving texts, the biographies, the histories, the political analyses of Caesar and his era, when were they written? How many years or decades or centuries after his death? By whom? With access to what primary sources? Preserved through what chain of transmission? Suetonius wrote his life of Caesar roughly 150 years after Caesar's death, Plutarch around the same time. The surviving text of Caesar's own Gallic Wars comes to us through medieval manuscripts, the oldest of which dates to approximately the 9th century, nearly 1,000 years after Caesar wrote it, and those 9th century manuscripts themselves. We have them because of their inclusion in specific monastic libraries and royal collections from precisely the institutions that were operating during the consolidation period. Now, where are the manuscripts of the Gallic Wars that those 9th century copies were copied from? Where are the 6th century copies, the 4th century copies, the 1st century copies written close to Caesar's own time? Gone! The most politically important text of one of the most documented figures in ancient history, and the physical manuscript chain supporting it, disappears entirely before the medieval period. What we have are copies of copies of copies, transmitted to us through monastic and royal libraries, authenticated by standards established in the 18th and 19th centuries. I'm not saying Caesar didn't write the Gallic Wars. I'm saying that the evidentiary chain we rely on to confirm that he did is far thinner, far more dependent on institutional authority, and far less independently verifiable than the confidence with which historians speak about ancient history implies. And this is the most documented figure of the classical world. What about the figures who were less celebrated, less useful to the narrative? The historians whose accounts complicated the Roman story, the philosophers whose frameworks contradicted the Platonic tradition that became central to European intellectual heritage, the chroniclers whose records described things that didn't fit. Their texts burned, if they ever existed, if they survived long enough to burn. There's a haunting document I want to tell you about. In 1562, Bishop Diego de Landa, a Franciscan friar in the Yucatan, conducted what he called an act of faith. He gathered together every Maya manuscript, every codex, every document produced by Maya scribes across generations of sophisticated intellectual and spiritual tradition, and he burned them. By his own account, he wrote about it himself. He described the Mayas as being extraordinarily distressed by this destruction, weeping for their texts as they burned. He acknowledged that the manuscripts contained histories, astronomical knowledge, religious traditions, medical knowledge, records of governance and law. He burned them anyway, because they were the work of the devil, because they contained knowledge incompatible with the world he was building. We have 4 Maya codices today, 4, from a civilization that maintained a professional scribal class for over 1,000 years, that ran sophisticated schools, that produced texts across multiple fields of knowledge. 4 books survived. And the extraordinary thing is that De Landa represents the only case where we have a clear, documented, first-person account of deliberate systematic book destruction in the early modern period. One man, one region, one religion, a few weeks of burning. The question I want you to ask is this. If one bishop in one corner of the world could destroy an entire civilization's written heritage in a single documented event, and that event is treated as a horrific but isolated tragedy, what happened in the places where the destruction was never documented, where no one wrote down what they were burning or why, where the destruction was less focused, more diffuse, more deniable, more easily absorbed into the general narrative of accidental loss and natural decay? We know about De Lander because he wrote it down himself. He wasn't hiding, he was proud, he was doing God's work. The fires in Europe's libraries weren't accompanied by confessions. They were accidents, natural disasters, regrettable losses, the language of tragedy rather than agency. But the result was identical. I want to address an objection because it's the most common one and it deserves a serious response. The objection is this: if there were suppressed texts, if there were destroyed books containing knowledge incompatible with the official narrative, why can't we find evidence of their contents in secondary sources? Why don't the books that survived mention the books that didn't? Why aren't there references to this suppressed knowledge in the documents we do have? It's a fair question. Here's the answer. Some of those references exist. Medieval Islamic scholars referenced Greek and Roman texts that we no longer have. Renaissance humanists mentioned manuscripts they'd consulted that have since disappeared. Early modern natural philosophers cited treatises on mathematics and astronomy that don't appear in any surviving collection. The secondary literature contains ghosts, referenced texts whose titles we know, whose contents were described in passing, whose influence on the authors who cited them is evident, but whose physical existence is unconfirmed. Scholars call them lost texts. They're acknowledged. They're even catalogued in some cases. There are academic databases of known lost works of classical antiquity, medieval Europe, the Islamic world. The existence of those databases is not reassuring, it is terrifying. Because what those databases tell us is that even from the fragments that survived, even from the second-hand references preserved in the books that made it through the fires, we can document a vast literature that no longer exists. And those databases only capture the losses that were referenced in surviving texts. The texts that were completely destroyed, that left no reference in any surviving secondary source, are by definition invisible to us. We can't catalogue what we don't know existed. We can only see the shadows of the losses that were incompletely erased. Let me bring this back to something concrete and verifiable, because I don't want this to float into abstraction. Go to any major research library, not a public library, a research library, the kind with special collections and restricted access and staff archivists who can pull manuscripts from controlled storage environments. Ask to see original manuscripts from before 1700. You will find some. I'm not going to pretend there's nothing. There are surviving manuscripts from the medieval period. The claim isn't total absence. The claim is systematic scarcity that falls far below what the centuries of literate, book-producing civilization that supposedly preceded the fires should have generated. But here is what I want you to pay attention to when you find those manuscripts. Ask about their provenance. Ask where the library acquired them. Ask when. Ask what documentation of custody exists for the periods between their supposed creation and their arrival at the institution where they now live. What you will find, almost universally, is a provenance chain that passes through the 18th or 19th century. Documents acquired during the Napoleonic Wars. Manuscripts donated from aristocratic estates during the consolidation of national libraries. Texts that surfaced in the antiquarian book markets of London or Paris or Amsterdam or Vienna during the exact period when everything else was burning. Authenticated by the institutional standards of the same period. Integrated into the collections of the same state-sponsored institutions that arose to replace what had been lost. And the pre-18th century links in those chains. The documentation of where the manuscripts were between their creation and their arrival in the modern record. Gaps, transfers during upheaval, periods of consolidation, custodians who can't be identified, acquisition circumstances that can't be verified. Every single time. This is not a marginal observation. This is visible in the institutional records of every major manuscript collection in the world, if you know what you're looking for, and you're willing to press past the comfortable explanations. Here is the question I keep returning to. Not what was destroyed, not how or by whom or whether it was deliberate. The question is, what do we do with the history we have? Because here's the uncomfortable answer. We can't unknow what we know. The history we've inherited, the narrative of human civilization from antiquity through the medieval period and into modernity, is the history built on the surviving fragments, on the authenticated manuscripts, on the texts that made it through the fires and the floods and the acts of faith and the revolutionary dispersals and the convenient accidents of the 1650 to 1850 window. That history might be substantially accurate, the fragments might be representative, the losses might be genuinely random, and the surviving texts might tell a story that closely approximates what the full record would tell. But we don't know that, we can't know that. We can't know it because the verification mechanism was destroyed. The primary sources that would allow us to check the copies against the originals are gone. We can't know it because the authentication system is circular, built on comparison documents whose own authentication depends on the same chain. We can't know it because the institutions that hold what survives were built by the same political forces that presided over the destruction of what didn't. What we have is a history built on faith. Faith in the accuracy of copies, faith in the integrity of institutional authentication, faith in the good intentions of the states and families and churches that decided what to preserve and what to let burn. And when you look at the pattern, when you trace the timeline, when you notice what burned and what didn't, what was lost and what was protected, whose knowledge disappeared and whose survived, that faith becomes very hard to sustain. I want to end with something specific. There are scholars, serious academic scholars working within the mainstream historical profession, who have raised versions of these questions, who have noted the anomalous scarcity of pre-modern primary sources, who have documented the clustering of library losses in the early modern period, who have flagged the circularity of manuscript authentication methods, who have pointed to the gaps in provenance chains. These scholars are not famous. Their work is not cited in general histories or popular narratives. Their questions sit in footnotes, in specialist journals, in conference papers delivered to rooms of 15 people. Because the mainstream of the historical profession has a structural incentive to not ask these questions loudly. The entire edifice of academic history, the careers, the institutions, the funding, the publications, the public authority of the discipline, rests on the assumption that the record we have is broadly reliable, that the authentication standards are sound, that the losses, while regrettable, were random. If those assumptions are wrong, or even if they're uncertain to the degree that the evidence suggests they should be uncertain, the implications are not just academic, they're civilizational. Because we have built our understanding of what humanity is, what we've done, what we're capable of, what we've tried and failed and learned across millennia of conscious existence, on a documentary record that was filtered through 2 centuries of fire, and then authenticated by the institutions that benefited from the filtration. What survived wasn't necessarily what was most important. What survived was what was allowed to survive. And what we've been given as history, as the foundation for our understanding of the deep human past, is the version that remained after the selection was complete. Whether the selection was deliberate or not, the mechanism was the same. The custodians of knowledge in the early modern period made choices, explicit or implicit, about what to protect and what to risk, about what to relocate before the fires and what to leave behind, about what to authenticate and republish, and what to classify as forgery or obscenity or heresy. And we are living downstream of those choices. Reading the books that were permitted to survive, learning the history that was considered safe to preserve, building our civilization on a foundation whose pre-modern depths are almost entirely invisible to us, because the evidence that might have shown us something different, something more complex, something that didn't fit the story being constructed in the laboratories and parliaments and national archives of the 1700s and 1800s, that evidence burned. The dark secret behind why pre-1800 books were destroyed is not one thing. It's not one conspiracy, one decision, one night of deliberate arson with clear villains and clear intentions. It's something more pervasive than that, and in some ways more disturbing. It's the accumulated effect of a civilization deciding what kind of past it needed, and then, through the accumulated weight of 1,000 individual choices about what to protect and what to risk, constructing a documentary record that provided exactly that past. The books burned because knowledge is power, and power decides what knowledge survives. And what survived is what power could live with. Go find the list, count the fires yourself, trace the provenance chains, notice what burned and what didn't, notice who lost their libraries and who didn't, notice what categories of knowledge appear consistently in the lists of losses, notice when the surviving manuscripts were authenticated and by whom. And then ask yourself whether what we call history is the record of what happened, or the record of what we were allowed to know about what happened. Because I think you'll find those are two very different things. And the distance between them was measured in fire. If this reached you in a way that the official history hasn't, if you're seeing the pattern now and you want to go deeper, subscribe. This kind of research doesn't get platform support, it gets buried. Your support is what keeps it alive.